good afternoon, and I always say good evening, good morning, depending upon where you're watching from. Welcome. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Thank you and welcome to tonight's extraordinary guests, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, and welcome and thanks also to tonight's moderator, the wonderful Madeleine Brand. Next week, before Rosh Hashanah, or the Jewish New Year, we have two back-to-back programs accommodating for the holiday. One is on this Sunday and one is on Monday. Sunday at 10 a.m. Pacific, we will hear from Aluf Ben, the editor-in-chief of Israel's longest-running newspaper, Haaretz, with all that is unfolding in Israel, both with Hezbollah in the north and the Gaza war. We look forward to getting updated information and analysis from Aluf Ben. He's an astute observer of the news, having served in that newsroom for many years, and from an Israeli perspective. So it will be the 19th Israel in Crisis program since last year. We hope you'll join us. It'll be the last one between now and Election Day. Then on Monday at 5 Pacific, we will welcome Ken Burns, a renowned filmmaker whom you will all know. He will provide us with his perspective on the state of American life and politics from his very unique lens. Now, to introduce and engage our guest tonight, please welcome my friend, colleague, and partner in this America at a Crossroads series, former Congressman Mel Levine. Mel?
Thanks so much, Janice. It's such a pleasure to introduce this highly informed and insightful husband and wife team, Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker, and Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. In my house, The New Yorker trumps the LA Times. So she gets the first introduction. They both have extremely impressive journalism backgrounds, careers, and awards, including working collaboratively for 4 years in Russia as Moscow bureau chiefs, after which they've written 3 books together, and I know that Peter at least has written a bunch of others in addition. I'm not going to detail the extensive awards they've achieved or anything beyond the books that they have written together. They're all superb, and I recommend them to our audience. They wrote Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia in 2005 after they left Moscow, and a fabulous biography of James Baker in 2020 entitled The Man Who Ran Washington. And then most recently, 2 years ago, 2022, they co-wrote The Divider, Trump in the White House. It's a great pleasure and honor to have them with us again this evening. Our superstar moderator, Madeleine Brand, will interview Peter and Susan. Madeleine also has too many accomplishments and awards to detail, so I will summarize that she is the host of the award-winning daily news show and cultural show, Press Play, on NPR affiliate KCRW. And rather than going through the rest of her impressive background, I will simply say that it's especially important to some of us that she is a proud California Golden Bear. Madeleine?
Yes, go Bears. Go Bears. That was many moons ago, but thank you very much for that generous introduction. And welcome back, Peter and Susan. It's so great to see you again. And I'm excited to talk to you again. The last time was so fascinating when we talked about your book, The Divider, Trump in the White House. So I'm sure we'll get to some of your Trump observations, the then and the now. But first, I want to just ask you, Peter, your chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. What are you doing these days? I really haven't heard much about President Biden since, I mean, now I guess I heard him at UNGA, but before, what has he been up to, the president?
Yeah, just kind of, first of all, thank you guys for having us. We're always delighted to be with you. And this remains, I think, the most impressive of all these kinds of events that we do around the country. You guys have the most impressive constant high-level conversations and extraordinary audiences, and we're always delighted to be a part of it. So thank you for having us again. But yeah, I'd say it's kind of, puttering around the White House, basically, kind of It's kind of quiet there these days. It's a little, you can hear the crickets. The other day I went there for a little gathering, and we just took a tour and found the White House swimming pool, which doesn't look like it's been used for a while. So it's a quieter place right now without an election campaign. Obviously, there's a lot going on. I mean, particularly we can talk about the Middle East and we can talk about Ukraine. That's always going to be in any commander in chief's wheelhouse, no matter whether he's running for office again or not. But beyond that, I think you're right. The energy and the attention has drifted elsewhere, obviously, for good reason. And President Biden is still giving a speech from time to time, as he did yesterday. But he knows that that the spotlight is heading in a different direction.
And he's not campaigning for Harris at all, is he? Either
It's funny.
body.
He said he would, and he has done a few, events here and there, but not with any great intensity. No. You have to wonder why that is. And I haven't done the reporting. I suspect that while Vice President Harris is appreciative of President Biden and thinks that he is, an asset on some level, her desire is to distance herself to some extent, not because he's unpopular or anything like that, but because she's trying to say that she is change, right? She is the change agent, and she doesn't look like a change agent if she's tethered to Biden's side. And I think that in that sense, he's doing what she wants him to do.
Yeah. And so, Susan, you wrote about the debate, and you said that Trump had a really bad debate, and polls show that most people agreed with you. Even, undecided voters, even when they were in focus groups, said, oh my God, she creamed him. And then yet you look at the polls and it's still neck and neck, really close. Your poll, or Peter, your newspaper had Trump up in the Sun Belt states. So why do you think that is, Susan? Why wasn't she able to convert this incredible win? I mean, that debate was a disaster for Trump in so many ways, into more support in the polls.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only a great question, it's probably the question in many ways, right? And of course, it's not news on some level that we're in this essentially 50-50 country, but it's kind of shocking nonetheless to be confronted with a very clear-cut evidence of it. And I think this is the first most compelling, clear-cut evidence of it, because in many ways, up until now, you had the Biden factor earlier in the election. And, clearly there were many Democrats and Democratic leaning independent voters who just weren't sold on another Biden term, even before his own disastrous debate performance. So the numbers, were kind of misleading to a certain extent. Remember, Donald Trump's support essentially is inflexible. It hasn't changed very much. So to the extent we've seen movement in this race at all, it was the movement of Democrats and undecided, but generally Democratic leaning independents who, were struggling to embrace the Democratic candidate. Harris has now consolidated those voters. There are positive indications for her in many of the swing states, certainly in the, must-win 3 states for her of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those numbers generally closer, but still within the margin of error in many surveys. And I just think that, the reality 9 years into the Trump era, it can feel a lot like, we're in a kind of a doom loop. If you go back and look at some of the polling averages, the June or the summer of 2023 polling averages with Biden rather than Harris before he began his slide, they're basically identical to where we are today.
Really?
All that effort. Yeah.
Right. And we're right back where we started.
Yeah, essentially, we don't know.
The new candidate.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that being said, we all recognize that she has had probably, the strongest debut as a party nominee that, certainly in recent history. And, you got to imagine that does make a difference, even if it's in very marginal ways.
Right. So how do you view the polls? Do you get up every morning and check out Real Clear Politics and see what's happening? Or do you, how are we to look at it as we're entering October? This is the crucial month. So.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think you all go to sleep for the next month, and we will be right back where we are right now when we wake up. I mean, the truth is we'll watch these polls every day and we'll say, oh my gosh, they have it at 4, they have it at 1, they have it at -1. And that's interesting, and it's engaging in a lot of ways. But the truth is, as Susan said, I don't think it's going to move very much. I think we're basically where the country is where it's at. And the only question is, are those handful of people who voted for Biden last time because they didn't like Trump, but didn't like Biden all that much to begin with, and were really turned off by him for whatever reason the last 4 years because he was too old or because of inflation or immigration, can Harris draw them back in and say, okay, remember that guy Trump you hated last time? He's just as bad now as he was then, and I'm an acceptable alternative. She has to sell herself as an acceptable alternative. She's done a good job, as Susan said in this debut. But basically, I don't know that absent some sort of exigent event that we're not able to predict, some sort of foreign crisis that changes people's impressions, I think we're going to be in 30 or 40 days pretty close to where we are right now. And it will all come down to those final days of turnout and getting people to the polls.
So you're saying it all comes down to turnout?
I'm saying it all comes down to turnout.
Okay.
But turnout does begin now, by the way. It is fair enough to say the election has already been, right? That's something that's different. The election, in effect, is a 6-week election day because of early voting and mail-in voting.
And also, it comes down to the undecideds, right? Are they going to be undecided? Or are they going to go to the polls? Are they not? Are they going to?
Although the truth is that you could say that that's a kind of an older paradigm in our politics, and and it's frustrating because, of course, we're like, who the hell is undecided after 9 years of Donald Trump? You would think positive or negative that most people have made up their minds. I think that, first of all, the numbers in polls are, generally higher of undecideds than they actually are, or people who call themselves independents, so they actually have pretty reliable information. So it's a smaller number. And then even within that, there may be people who actually have been either 2-time Trump voters already or, not voting for Trump already. So you might even already have a strong sense of which way they're going to go. Ever since the Obama era, the political strategists, they really say that it's not the era of persuasion, of persuading of undecided voters, that it's really the era of mobilization. And because American voter turnout is lower than some other democracies, although it's been going up in the last few elections, it's still pretty low. So that means that the outcome can vary pretty significantly if you get low propensity voters who are still nonetheless not really undecided voters, but they may or may not turn out. That's where a lot of the money is spent. It's where a lot of the effort is spent. And I think that's a way to understand the answer to your first question, which is a great question, which is, okay, how come Harris does well in a debate and yet it doesn't change? In part, that's because listen to the stuff that Trump is saying. It's designed to appeal to his voters. And this is the kind of politician that he's been since he entered our political life. He's a base politician. He is always campaigning to red America. As president, as you know, he considered himself only the president of red America. He even said that out loud multiple times in the 2020 election year. And I think that's what we're seeing. So the rest of the country is like, what is this with dogs and, making up slurs about Haitian immigrants and, or when he gave the interview to the National Association of Black Journalists and he's talking about Harris's race. But my view is that was not just the kind of crazy gaffe that it might seem to be, but that it's Donald Trump in his own way speaking to his voters because he thinks it will work with them and that he wants to talk about immigration and race. And he wants you thinking, oh, she's Black. Oh, and I think that, that's part of the explanation.
But that also runs counter to the standard wisdom that you should, in a general, move to the center. You have your base, you have your voters excited. They will turn out for you. So you don't need to, service them anymore. You need to kind of pull in the people who are on the fence. So what is the strategy there?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that over 9 years, Trump has really done nothing to expand his base, even as president. We're talking about typical politics. That's out the window these days, right? He comes into office, the typical president comes into office and tries to at least reach out to the idea of leading all the people and build on the support you might have had in the election through policy or politics. He never really made that effort. He just never really cared about reaching out to people who didn't support him. It really is about sticking together the people who brought him to the dance, right, as they say. And he's done a good job of that. And he's done a much better job than people would have imagined. Even fellow Republicans were surprised how well he has consolidated that Republican support. But he's not reached out to the middle, what little middle there really is. And there's only a very tiny tiny amount of people who are genuinely in the middle these days. He doesn't really care about them. It's not his goal. His goal is to overwhelm you with his voters, not to reach out to people who don't agree with him.
So he's 78 years old, right? And I'm wondering, you've been in his head for longer than most people, or longer than most people would want to be. How do you see him now? Compare him to 4 years ago, 8 years ago, whatever. And you read his posts on Truth Social, listen to his rallies. Does he seem crazier, angrier to you these days than he did in previous elections?
You know, it's a great question, if not the question, right now. And his age-related impairment strikes me as real, but also not in some ways as visible. For example, President Biden, he both struggled to walk, and his voice was getting softer. It was harder and harder for him to project, to be the communicator in chief. Trump's challenges, I think, are different ones. And I will say, we had an entire chapter in our book, The Divider, about the summer, about the August of 2019, called The Summer of Crazy. So it's not like, he just didn't start saying wild-eyed stuff about Hannibal Lecter and sharks and electric boats in this 2024 campaign. If you listen to one of his rallies in 2020, you will already notice wild digressions, many, many untruthful statements. This is a guy who has a trouble in any setting offering you a sentence with a noun and a verb and a period. Okay, so that was already true throughout the entirety of his presidency. However, with all of that being said, go look at a clip of him in 2016 at one of his rallies, or in his debate, one of his debates with Hillary Clinton. And you will notice a difference. I mean, there's a very clear difference. And where I see it is in a couple ways. One, he's a much more negative and angry character. I think that is fair. The escalation in Trump's attacks on other people, in his violent negative rhetoric, it's more. It was always a facet of his personality and of his political persona, but it's definitely escalated. I think that's one. And then two, he's definitely just confusing things more often. Just today, I think it was, he confused Charlottesville. He called it Charlottetown. In this campaign, he's mixed up Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi. That's accelerating for him in a way that to me is noticeable. Am I leaving anything out there?
No, yeah. I mean, I think that it is hard to make that. Everybody, having spent the summer evaluating Biden's capacity and what impact age may or may not have had on it, is looking now to see about Trump, who's just 3 years younger, right? But I think, as Susan pointed out, it's different. I mean, like and part of the issue is the rambling, the sometimes incoherent sentences, the what the heck is he talking about kind of nature of his rallies is a feature, not a bug. It's something that's been there for a while, and measuring how much it's changed over time, in other words, how much his age had an impact, is a challenge. And we're actually kind of trying to grapple with that, I think, right now with some stories. But it's no question that you can go to a Trump rally, and he has the energy to go through an hour and a half rally in a way that I don't know that President Biden would have necessarily done. And he will go out there and he'll take questions from time to time, usually friendlier interviewers, but he's willing to mix it up at times. But he is living in this sometimes completely different world, right? And the question about being, how attached to reality can he be? And you can mix up names and dates and faces and facts. We all do that. I do that in my 50s. I think that's not necessarily surprising at age 70 something, but what his detachment from reality is far more significant, right? He said the other day that at that debate, it was unfair to him and the audience went wild. There was no audience. I mean, that's just, yeah. That's not like I'm mixing up two people who happen to look alike, or I just got confused about what town I'm in, which are important. But I think what we're seeing is even more significant, where he has a reality that doesn't match everybody else's reality. And it's small things like there was an audience there when there wasn't. And it's bigger things like, Haitians are eating dogs and cats, and I'm just going to go with that, even though there's zero evidence of that. And it's saying things like crime is up when crime is down. It's saying that, the economy is terrible, and in fact, the economy is good.
But he's always been like that. The problem is that Donald Trump, I mean, if you said in 2016, would Donald Trump lie about Haitian immigrants eating dogs? I wouldn't shock you to say yes, he would. That he would lie in a calculated way to say that crime is up when crime is down, or that the economy is bad when it's good or good when it's bad.
But it seems more, right? I think that's what we're saying is that at least in a subjective way, it's hard to objectively quantify this in a metric. It's subject. I was watching a speech he gave in 2011 today, just an old speech, just to go back and try to measure some of the changes we're talking about. And it was striking. It was a very different kind of speech. It was much more lucid, and it had it wasn't nearly as angry as to Susan's point. There wasn't as much harshness in it. And I think he's gotten darker and darker. He started his presidency with American Carnage, but I think we're really even more dark in the way he presents now.
Right. And so how do you, like you say, he's always said these lies. And so that's not necessarily an indication of age-related mental decline. But maybe there are other things that are instances of age-related mental decline. And I guess there's this whole fire hose of Trump crazy that we get a little inured to it. How do you, covering this man and covering this campaign, how do you tease that apart and present what is really happening with the Republican nominee who could very well be the next president of the United States? Like, how do you think about that when you're presenting him to your readers as this person who may be losing his grip on reality?
Well, I think whether Susan may have a different point of view. I think whether it's a grip on reality or just he's saying things that are shocking, either way, I think we have a responsibility to communicate that to our readers. And I think that there's sort of a feeling among a lot of people in the media and politics that we shouldn't necessarily get wrapped up in every outrageous thing he says, because that's what he wants, right? He's trying to draw your attention, and we're falling for the bait. But on the other hand, I think that we should take him seriously on some of these things. For instance, that he did say that he believed in termination of the Constitution in order to return him to power right away without having another election. Now, that's not a joke. That's a serious thing. He's not able to do it, right? It's not a serious possibility, but that's his attitude. That is, right? And when he says, I want to be a dictator on day one, now he says, well, I was just joking. But that's not the kind of thing you joke about, I don't think. And I think that when he says these things, it's important for us as media to take them seriously and present them to readers. Whether they take them seriously or not, that's up to them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's gotten a lot of attention this year, journalists made up the term sane washing to talk about sort of the conventions of our, kind of classic journalism, filtering the statements by public people through the kind of, universal news language, so that you just use one quote or two, and then you say, like, Donald Trump yesterday gave a policy-oriented speech in North Carolina in which he rolled out a new tax plan and also talked about his plan to bring manufacturing back to the country. You could write that lead about the rally that he had in North Carolina, and it would not convey the insanity of this man. It wouldn't convey the fact that, sure, his campaign gave him, a talking point on the teleprompter to read about manufacturing jobs, and that he read that, and that was, 10% of an hour and a half long speech that also, covered his feelings about the decline in the quality of chairs that are being sold in North Carolina, and how you might get sued at your hotel because somebody would sit in a chair and they would fall down in the chair, and then they would be sitting on the floor, and then you might get sued. And by the way, that is an actual thing that Donald Trump said in a campaign rally in North Carolina when he was, quote unquote, rolling out his policy plan. And the other thing that that conventional news language wouldn't tell you about that Trump rally is that the dumbing down, there are, pick your phrase, but the incredible vapid nature of what passes for quote unquote policy discourse here. Okay. So it makes me kind of crazy when they'll be like, Donald Trump is talking about economics today. You know what his economic plan is to fight inflation? He has said his economic plan, and this has actually become part of the official national Republican platform this year. His plan to fight inflation is that he will convene a cabinet meeting on day one, and he will order his cabinet secretaries to stop inflation. That is his policy. Okay. That's a policy plan. What is his policy on Ukraine? Okay, this is the largest land war, largest and deadliest land war in Europe since the end of World War II. The official policy statement of the Republican nominee is that I will end it in 24 hours. Magic wand.
Yeah.
Clicking his heels 3 times. I mean, that's the policy. So, again, for journalists, this is an enormous challenge. And obviously 9 years into it, it's not like anyone has a particular formula, but I think Peter's right that making sure that we don't fall prey to conventions that, facilitate and enable this, I think it's an important one. I do. I actually think it matters.
And Peter, the New York Times has gotten particular scrutiny over this sane washing, this bias towards coherence, as Jeffrey Goldberg once. And so I'm wondering how you deal with it with your editors and headline writers, because a lot of it is the headlines. They make it sound, as Susan said, like a sane rally, when in fact there's just a lot of, sharks and all that kind of stuff.
Well, we also do the sharks and the electric boats stories as well. And
yeah.
so
We
did do the sharks and electric boat story. And we tend to do stories on almost all of these kind of, they're not often noticed. And so we get credit, we get blamed for not writing things we actually did write. And that sometimes people don't necessarily notice because we do publish a large volume of stories. But, look, I think we are grappling with this. I wrote a story about a week or so ago about how, his what seemed to be his cognitive challenges was going to be a real issue for him in the last weeks of the debate, but in the debate and the last weeks of the campaign. And I used some examples of things he had been talking about and lay them out there at length for readers. And I think we ought to do a little bit more of that. I think we probably will.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, well, we could spend the whole hour talking about Trump and keep going on. But actually, I do want to talk about one thing he said and get your take on this, especially for this audience. He said, if I don't win this election, the Jewish people would really have a lot to do with that. How did you read that? And what do you think he was trying to say there?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was trying to say exactly what you think he was trying to say. Donald Trump is outraged that, not everybody is not only as transactional as he is, but, as willing to articulate that. Trump thinks that, I gave you what you wanted, because he thinks that he gave the Jewish people a capital in Jerusalem. He thinks that he gave them whatever other concessions he made to Israel when he was the president. He thinks that, I'm going to be better for Israel than the Democrats. So therefore it's a deal. So I'm going to live up to my deal. So then you have to vote for me. And he's just shocked when people have different values or different perceptions. But I think at the root of a statement like that, obviously it shows the kind of bullying persona he is. But it also shows at heart his attitude about politics, which is essentially that it is a deal. Everything is a transaction, and he's for sale. And screw you if you didn't get the memo that you bought me. So go ahead and give me your vote. That's part of the deal.
But do you think? I mean, do you think that this could actually lead to violence against Jews? I
mean, look, we are dealing with an incredible metastasization of anti-Semitism in this country, and it's been going up and up and up in recent years. Obviously, since October 7th, we've seen a spread of a number of incidents that's through the roof, and you have this paradox, right, with the Republicans, who on the one hand have embraced an official policy position of being kind of more pro-Israel than many Israelis. They've defined for themselves what being pro-Israel means. So it's really a paradox, right? You have this incredible view that if you don't support Israel as completely as we do and define it as narrowly as we do, then somehow many Democrats are now the anti-Israelis, according to a lot of Trump followers. At the same time, they tolerate a lot of intolerance. in their ranks, and that has included Donald Trump at times. Both Peter and I have heard amazing stories about Trump's personal views towards Jewish people.
Look, we call the book The Divider for a reason. He plays on these divisions. He said the same thing, by the way, about Catholic voters the other day. He said if you're
seniors,
if you're a Catholic voter, he says, then you're betraying in effect your faith if you vote for somebody other than me, right? And so he plays on these divisions. He sees the country in blocks of people based on their ethnicity, their race, their religion, their national origin, their gender, their sexual orientation. And he's constantly trying to figure out how to play along those dividing lines to his advantage.
I mean, do you see that this at all as a possibility, that if he is reelected, he drops his support of Israel because he really wants the approval of Vladimir Putin? Putin and Iran are closer than Putin and Netanyahu. And so I'm wondering if that is something that is it all in the realm of possibility that he would say, you know what, we're actually not going to, the United States is no longer going to be a supporter of Israel.
I would say that the bigger reason that he might do something that would seem to be anti-Israel would be because he doesn't like Netanyahu, right? He feels that Netanyahu betrayed him, and he's mad at Netanyahu because he feels like he gave him everything. Now, we write this in our book too. About a year out, he started really, distancing himself from Netanyahu because he felt like Netanyahu was using him and not properly deferential to him for all the things he had done. And he really got hacked off at him after the election when Netanyahu did the thing that you're supposed to do, which is to congratulate the winner, and which is, of course, Joe Biden. Now, they've kissed and made up recently at Mar-a-Lago, and for now, obviously, he's going to, I think, position himself as more pro-Israel than Biden, although Biden's been pretty pro-Israel. But I think you shouldn't assume that's a given that he would stay pro-Israel if for some reason Netanyahu did something that made him mad. I think he is as mercurial today as he's ever been, and he could easily decide, I don't think that they're doing the right thing, and I think you need to stop. He has said you need to get this war over with. He himself has expressed ambivalence about the war in Gaza. I haven't heard him talk too much about Hezbollah, but so he doesn't have a connection to Israel in a personal sense, other than he thinks they ought to support him because he gave them something, as Susan said, very transactional.
Even though his daughter is Jewish, converted, his son-in-law is observant.
I don't think he thinks in those terms. I think he is so transactional that it's important to remember that, he can't get too far away from his party either. And, the Republican Party has made, especially the evangelical white Christian voters who are at the core, they are the single most loyal Republican voting bloc that we have in this country. And he's not going to just willy-nilly defy them. Now, presidents have a lot more leeway in foreign policy. Obviously, it's hard to imagine a party that would embrace Vladimir Putin at this point that would be an American political party. But Donald Trump, as you said, is continuing to seek his approval. And one of the things that's really remarkable about this moment in time is that you've seen almost a fusion of interests between Israel and North Korea and Russia and China in a way that, that was like the kind of scary fever dream, of America's hawks, a decade and a half ago.
You mean Iran, not Israel, right?
But at this moment in time, it's actually happened. And you don't hear Donald Trump addressing that. And in fact, he's campaigning and speaking admiringly of many of those people, with the exception of Iran. Who does he talk about on the campaign trail? He talks about how I had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin. I had a very good relationship with Xi Jinping. I had a very good relationship with Kim Jong-un. This is literally the axis of America's adversaries. And they are working in concert with each other much more than ever before. And I think that whoever is the next president, whether it's Trump or Harris, this is likely to be like the signal foreign policy challenge that we're facing, not just the individual conflicts in the Middle East or in Ukraine or in the South China Sea, but in effect, working against a nexus of our adversaries who are working together far more closely than they were even when Trump was inaugurated in his first term in 2017.
What would he do if China invaded Taiwan?
I don't know that Taiwan should assume that Trump would come to their defense. He doesn't have that feeling in him, right? Traditional Republicans do, and therefore maybe that would push Trump into doing something. A lot of Republican hawks have made Taiwan their sort of sine qua non, even to the exclusion of Ukraine, even more so. Like, well, we don't really care about Ukraine, but we really care about Taiwan. That's the real issue. That's not how Trump thinks about this. When Trump thinks about China, he doesn't see it as a strategic threat. He's not thinking about the South China Sea or freedom of navigation or the Spratly Islands or any of this stuff. He sees it as an economic threat, right? It's all about trade balance and tariffs and so forth, intellectual property maybe. He has no love lost for Taiwan specifically, and I'm not sure that anybody should assume that it's a rock solid thing that he would do something or what he would do exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of rock solid Republicans, you wrote a story, Peter, recently about Liz Cheney endorsing Harris and possibly calling for another political party. But what else is really interesting in that article is she wants to flip the House. So she wants the House to flip because she's really afraid that they won't certify the election.
Yeah.
What is the likelihood of that she sees? Does she see it as a certitude that Johnson and the Republicans would not certify?
Well, I think she's definitely worried about that. Yes, I think Liz Cheney is really interesting. She is remaining singularly focused on Trump as a threat as she sees it to the democratic system, right? Everything else is subordinate to that. China, Ukraine, healthcare, taxes. She has positions on a lot of those. In some cases, she might actually agree with Trump. But to her, the only thing that matters is, do we elect somebody who abides by the Constitution? She lived through January 6th. She spent 2 years investigating it. To her, that is it. And she sees this still as a very threatened moment where, in fact, Mike Johnson, who wrote a legal brief on behalf of Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election, is now the Speaker of the House, and in theory could have some influence over the counting of the Electoral College votes, or if there's not a majority of electoral college votes, the issue would then go to the House, in which case the Republicans have an advantage because the House, in such an instance, would vote by state. Each delegation would get one vote, and the Republicans, even if they lose the House in terms of overall numbers, would likely have a majority of the delegations. Anybody get that?
Sorry, that's our coworker Ellie.
Oh, okay, great. Okay. Susan, all right. So I have you to myself. Let me ask you just to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about Kamala Harris. And I was wondering what you made of the fact that she did that interview with Oprah recently. She hasn't done a lot of interviews, but with journalists, but she did that interview with Oprah recently. And she said that if anyone broke into her house, they would be shot. Did that surprise you? And do you think that was an off the cuff remark or was it planned?
It did surprise me. I think it was, I don't know if it was off the cuff in that exact moment, but I think it was calculated. I think very interestingly, if you look at Harris, she has taken a very different approach to being possibly the first woman president than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. And there have been a lot of effort on the part of Harris and her campaign to emphasize her toughness and her credentials as a kind of a tough person. She's not out there talking about breaking the glass ceiling. She's not wearing white like the suffragettes. If you noticed in the debate against Trump, she used multiple times. She sought to portray herself as the stronger, tougher character in the field. I think that's also a little bit of trolling of Trump, which, as we know, she's kind of taken a different approach to than Biden. She's much more openly tweaking Trump. And, what is Donald Trump's favorite word to use about himself or others? Strong, tough. And I think she's seeking to appropriate that. So when she made that comment about the gun, I thought that was really much in the context of this effort by her campaign to undercut concerns about her as the first woman president without specifically talking about her as the first woman president. That to me was what that was about.
Yeah. Peter, we were talking about the guns and
yeah.
the gun comment that she made, that she would shoot someone if they broke into her house. That's
Yeah.
not something that you normally hear Democrats say.
No, but I think Susan's right. I think it's an intentional signal, and it's really interesting. It tells you something about where she comes from as a candidate too, because she didn't have to go. If I'm repeating, I apologize. She didn't have to go through a primary, right? So she didn't have to tack to the left in order to win the nomination. She's going for a general election audience, and therefore, as Susan said, trying to make herself look tough, and also just like appeal to, you know, people by saying, I'm not some anti-gun nut, I'm not some super liberal, I'm a middle of the road, you know, center left, but not kind of crazy left candidate. And that's one way I think of signaling that for her.
Right. And so Tim Walz too brings up the fact that he can shoot, and it's a big deal. It's a big part of their campaign. The sort of, you know, middle of the country, Second Amendment loving.
We're not coming knocking on your doors, taking away your guns. That's the signal that they're trying to send.
Right. What do you think is the importance of next week's vice presidential debate?
Well, you know, look, those don't usually decide the presidential election. We know this is going to be a close election. Interestingly, J.D. Vance has really had one of the least successful vice presidential rollouts since, I don't know, Dan Quayle, maybe. He is at the moment by far the least popular of the four kind of national candidates right now. He has the worst approval ratings according to the surveys. And, you know, Walz has on benefit actually is viewed positively by Americans. That's hard to do right now when things are so polarized. He has had has a pretty genial personality and so far hasn't really been tarnished despite Republicans' efforts to tarnish him. So, you know, I think there'll be a lot of scrutiny on J.D. Vance and some of his, you know, really out there views. You know, the flip side is Vance is young. He is, you know, he's an experienced talker. He's been doing a lot of campaigning around the country, a ton of interviews, far more than any of the other three candidates. And so, you know, he might be much more in practice, you know, than Walz. And Walz, I think, is not as used to the national stage as Vance. Remember that Vance, while he's just a first-term senator, he had this kind of like very ballyhooed launch on the national stage as a best-selling writer and author, and of course Trump critic before he became a Trump sycophant. But you know, that could play to his advantage, I suppose, in terms of the debate. But yeah, people will be tuning in, but I don't think it's going to change that many minds about Donald Trump and Kamala Harris.
There will likely be questions about cats and dogs and vilifying Haitian migrants and immigrants in Springfield. And I'm wondering how that lands. They keep talking about it and he's not backing away from it. In fact, he's said that he's making up stories to get the media to pay attention to what's happening in Springfield. Does this help them? Because initially, of course, everyone thought it sounded insane.
Not just initially. Yeah, I think that I don't think it helps win them any new voters. That's for sure. It may be that it's, again, it galvanizes the voters they already have, right? Some of whom either believe it or say, look, you know, illegal immigration is really the only important issue. What's really striking is if you watch Trump rallies, I've been watching a bunch of them lately, sort of back to back to back. It's really almost a one issue campaign for him. I mean, he just talks about the border and immigration again and again and again, even during an economic speech. Even, you know, his rally speeches are immigration, 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 inflation, immigration, Ukraine, immigration, crime, immigration, Kamala Harris, terrible, communist, immigration. He comes back to it again and again and again. He really seems to both be most comfortable with it, most at home about it, and he thinks he won in 2016 on it, build the wall. It was his most successful line as he sees it. So I think that's one reason why they keep coming back to it. And they don't seem to be backing off things just because they're not true. That doesn't seem to be a problem. Now, I think what you'll see Vance try to do, I think Susan's right. He's a good talker, and he has been more willing to mix it up with reporters. And that's obviously to his benefit as a practice in a way. He'll try to turn the tables on Walz on the military experience, on how he claimed in effect to be more than he was as a reservist and so forth. We'll have to see how Walz handles that. He's a good, Susan says genial. I think he is genial, but he's also a scrapper. I think it's one of the reasons why Kamala Harris picked him in the first place. He was very scrappy on television in going after Vance and Trump in the build up to who got picked as the running mate. And I think that appealed to her. And he's not a soft guy. And I think it's going to be a pretty vigorous debate.
Okay, let's get to some of the viewers' questions. Miriam asks, what do you see as the impact of the uncommitted voters? What can the media do to help voters understand the complexity of the issues involved in the Israel-Gaza war? Do you think the media has a responsibility to do that type of educating? And I think she's talking about in Michigan, the uncommitted voters who held back their vote in the primary over the Joe Biden's support for Israel in the war in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to know. Of course, that is the state with the largest percentage of Arab American voters in the country relative to the overall electorate. The truth is, though, if you look at the surveys, there's not much significant difference that one can see between where Harris is polling in Michigan versus Wisconsin, for example, next door, where we were just in Wisconsin, and they just don't have the same size population that's motivated around that issue, and yet the numbers are pretty similar. It's interesting because Harris has not broken with Biden's policy toward Israel. She's been very careful on that. At the same time, I think there is a perception among many Democratic voters that she's a different generation. She doesn't have the same reflexive instincts toward always coming to Israel's defense. She, talks perhaps with more passion about the plight of the Palestinians than Biden does. So it's, different in emphasis, or perhaps an assumption that once she's in office, maybe she would have different outcomes. But even though she hasn't said anything like that. And I was really struck at the Democratic convention in Chicago this summer. We were both there. Democrats, what they want is to win. What they want is to win. And it was, when there were protesters, it was the Democratic activists around them who were immediately chanting to drown them out. We'll see. It's very early in the school years, for example, so you could see protests flare back up on campuses. With the news this week of what looks like it could possibly develop into all-out war and the northern front of Israel as well, we could be looking at a whole new round of activism in the United States and other Western countries. So, it's that could be our October surprise.
Yeah, and I think Biden's failure so far, at least, to get that ceasefire hostage deal that he thought he was going to be able to get at various points over the last few months is an anchor on the Democratic ticket, in the sense that if he had been able to do that a month ago, 2 months ago, as he thought they were going to be able to do, then we'd be in a different place. We'd be talking about something different. We'd be talking about hostages coming home. We'd be talking about what happens next with Reconstruction. We'd be talking about what happens in terms of figuring out governance in Gaza that doesn't include, the Hamas terrorist group. And because that didn't happen, and you can say it's Bibi Netanyahu's fault, you can say it's Sinwar's fault, you can say whatever, it means it's still a live issue. And I think that, yeah, we don't know how much effects that has on the campaign. But I think
for now, I don't think it has like a game-changing effect on the campaign. But
I think it depressed
right.
I think it had depressed the youth vote about when Biden was still in. But they seem now to be, if you look at the polls, most of them are more excited about Kamala Harris, obviously, than they ever were about Biden. And to the extent that they're concerned about Gaza, it doesn't seem to be the number one issue for a large number.
But when you have this increasing conflict in Lebanon, and maybe it will turn into an all-out war, this does play into what Donald Trump has talked about: a world out of control, all this chaos didn't happen under his watch, never would have happened, blah, blah, blah. There wasn't the war in Ukraine, there wasn't this war. And so does this then help him in that way when he's talking about bringing back order to the world state?
Yeah, I think it does, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's also, I think that it reflects a pretty simplistic, national conversation right now. The truth is that the country isn't very interested in what's happening around the world. So they fall prey to, the almost cartoonish version of the world as told by Donald Trump. This idea that, there would have been no war in Ukraine, or he's going to solve it in 24 hours. There was a war in Ukraine. And presidents in both parties in the United States failed to do anything about it in a meaningful way that might have stopped Putin from launching an all-out invasion. And that is a great tragedy of our time. But, what did Donald Trump do when he was president? He blackmailed Vladimir Zelensky, if that's the kind of order that he's bringing to the world. But people, there's a willful, Trump amnesia that comes to this. The idea that Donald Trump, whose signature line is appeasing dictators, is going to be the man who brings any kind of vision of American values-based foreign policy perspective to the challenges that we face. His most signature line beyond praising dictators was to consistently undercut America's allies. And that's something that I think people really don't have a full appreciation for. In a world of kind of metastasizing threats, the idea that, Trump is the guy that you want and he's going to bring stability. He was such an uncertain figure in the world that there was literally a Trump factor in the decision-making of many of these bad guys, because they were like, America's lost its mind.
Having said all that, and not disagreeing with any of it, I would say that there is this sense that the world is out of control, and that is definitely playing to his advantage. No question about that. You add the Afghanistan withdrawal, the war in the Middle East, the war in Europe, the idea that inflation was out of control for a while, the idea that the border was out of control for a while. Even though those numbers now come down, even though inflation is now back under control, it plays into an atmosphere in the electorate that's measured by polls. People who think that the world is that the country's going in the wrong direction, right? The wrong track number has been wrong for a long time in the United States. Really going back to Bush's second term, we haven't had a majority of Americans feel like the country is going in the right direction for 20 years. And that has gone down even further, I think, under Biden. And that's a challenge for Harris to try to respond to that.
Yeah. And how do you assess her foreign policy statements and what her plans are? Do you think that they are as detailed as perhaps you'd like, or could she?
Look, she's not a foreign policy student. She's not an expert on it. She has been immersed in kind of American national security decision making for the last 3.5 years. That definitely, she's way more fluent in the issues of global crisis now. She attends the PDB sometimes, the Presidential Daily Brief. She's in the Situation Room meetings when they're discussing important crises. She's met with Zelensky, I think it was something like 7 times. So she's definitely absolutely conversing in these issues in a way that I think you wouldn't have been able to say if she had to step in, as vice president at the beginning of Biden's term for some reason. So she's much more qualified and experienced now than she was before. She did serve, I think, on the Senate Intelligence Committee in her brief tenure in the Senate, but it's not her core issue. I was listening closely to her speech at the convention for that reason. That's probably the most that we've heard from her in terms of like just who she is in terms of values. And I was struck by the fact that she really presented herself as a kind of a classic liberal internationalist in a way that does suggest she's not going to make a sharp break. It also suggests that maybe to the progressive left as well as the far right in America, that she's not a natural ally of those. And I think that's important. And then the other thing that I think that's important, thinking about Harrison foreign policy, is, she's a lawyer. She's a prosecutor. That's the kind of perspective I expect her to bring, especially initially as she's getting up to speed on it. But, it's a really tough role. Like, imagine if she had been the president when those tanks rolled into Ukraine and not President Biden with his 50 years of foreign policy experience. I don't know, but it's quite possible that we would have had a different response.
Well, would she keep the same advisors, would the same people still be with her should she win? And then, that there would be that cushion, that continuity of decision making. Would Blinken stay, for example?
Tony Blinken is not going to stay, and I don't think Jake Sullivan's going to stay. But I think that a lot of the core people around her will be part of the same, broad spectrum of democratic national security thinkers, right? So I think that they'll give her a lot of the same advice. Mind you, a lot of the advice they gave to President Biden, he didn't take, right? He had his own strong view about things, and I think that's where the big difference. Susan sort of alluded to that. He had a very strong view of what he thought should be done. And they didn't really challenge him a lot of the times, right? Even on Afghanistan withdrawal, or, on how far he would let the Ukrainians go in terms of using American weapons and so forth. He had very strong views. They didn't agree with him on all things. They didn't agree with him on Israel, for instance, on exactly how he should approach them. She may be more, because she doesn't have the same confidence and experience that he has. She may be both A, more willing to listen, but B, less certain of herself, right? And less certain of her own views about things. And I think back to the early days of Bill Clinton when he was president. He came in as a governor, so he didn't have any foreign policy experience, and he was really uncertain about his own, his own theory of the case. She, as Susan said, has had more experience being on at least at the table now on foreign policy than, say, Bill Clinton did, or even Barack Obama did when he came in. But I don't hear from her a coherent worldview that you could say, aha, this is how she will respond. I think she's got a pretty conventional Democratic center-left view of the world, but it hasn't been tested before. And when it's tested, we'll see how she responds.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Clinton, then he presided over Camp David and also the Kosovo War. And so
He learned and became a better, more comfortable foreign policy president.
Yeah. Okay. We're kind of winding up here, but I did want to ask you sort of personally how you view your role as journalists in this age. I think there's a lot of I don't want to say despair, but disappointment amongst many people who cover Trump and Trumpism, that you present the facts and it doesn't matter to half the electorate, that there is a kind of preaching to the converted part of it. And I'm wondering how you're viewing your profession and your role now, when facts are, as we've seen, especially in this campaign, unimportant or fungible to many people.
After the 2016 election, when Trump was elected, I had been the editor of Politico during that election cycle. And I took the time and I wrote kind of a big essay for Brookings trying to answer, look at some of those questions. And I think you're right that it's very dispiriting, because when we grew up as journalists, there was a presumption, essentially. There was this phrase even, sunlight is the best disinfectant. We saw our role as, we kind of pick up the rock, and show you all the creepy crawly things underneath. And then, it's up to the system then to figure out what to do about it. And that this fundamental, kind of principle, the idea that accountability would follow the revelation of facts, it's that kind of social contract that's been broken, right? That Trump seems to be a quintessential example of recklessness, norm breaking, rule breaking, lying without accountability in our system. And, journalists see themselves as part of accountability in a democratic society. And so I think that, we're 9 years into this. That's the part that's hard for me. It's just that it's an incredible cyclical thing. People are having the same conversations. Let's talk about the Trump voters. Let's talk about, should we platform Donald Trump? And it feels like, how is it that we're just, on this, I think I already used the phrase doom loop in this conversation, but it's pretty grueling to be at it for 9 years and to feel like we're still in the same, literally the same gridlock that we were exactly 8 years ago at this time in the 2016 election.
How do you feel about possibly covering him for another 4 years?
I would say and we have slightly different roles in that Susan is a columnist and I'm a reporter, and so we operate slightly differently because of the publications that we're at and the roles we play. From my point of view, 38 years in journalism, I've learned a long time ago, it's not my job to care what the outcome is. My job is to get people the information that they need, and then they can make their own decisions. And then, if they choose to do X or Y, so be it. Journalism is about providing truth and facts and analysis, and not being outcome specific or outcome determinative. But you're right. If you ask about covering him for another 4 years, it is exhausting to cover him. I will say that as a journalist, because in fact he is a nonstop news making machine, and we have this debate, as Susan says, how much do you platform him? What do you follow everything he says? And if you do, that means you could be typing for 24 hours a day. And if so, how do you put him in context and analysis, and how do you fact check him in a way that's both fair but also assertive, because it is our job to cut through cut through lies, cut through falsehoods, and cut through conspiracy theories, and provide truthful, factual information to readers. So it is exhausting as a journalist, no question about it. But if it's what it is, it's what we'll do.
So you would keep the job if it's offered to you?
If they want me to do it, yeah. If my editors want me to do it.
What about me?
Well, I don't know if your editors want you to do it.
No, I meant you. Want you to keep doing it.
I want you to do what
I don't
you
know.
want to do.
I don't know. No, that's
you don't
not
want
the
me.
question.
You don't want me to do it. No, that's a different question.
Okay, that's something to be discussed off camera, I guess. All right. Well, we have come to the end of the hour, and I want to thank you both so much for coming back. It's been, as usual, a fascinating and enlightening conversation. So thank you so much. And thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great to be with you.
Great to be you. And Ellie says thank you too. That's our dog, who's expressing a little impatience here, but she enjoys
Very cute.
She enjoys us too.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, time's up.
Yeah, she's like, feed me now.
All right. You can come see on the camera. Come here.
Oh, yeah, bring her.
Yeah,
she's
here,
so cute.
Yeah.
She is. There she is.
Yeah.
She's got very strong views.
She want you to cover Trump for another 4 years?
As long as she's fed, I think she's okay with it.
All right. Well, thanks again. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
And for all of you out there, come back again this Sunday at 10. I'll be interviewing Aluf Ben about Israel. He is the editor-in-chief of Haaretz. So don't miss that program, Sunday at 10 a.m. Until then, bye. Have a great rest of your evening.